one. Here we go. All right, perfect. Hi, John. Nice to see you here.
Hey, Sam. Thanks for having me and my inaugural visit.
Absolutely. So, I was telling, well, I guess we might not have Shar today because I think she's having some connection problems, but hopefully we'll be able to go off without a glitch here. So, John, you're in California, right? Is that?
Yeah, based in San Francisco. Always lived on the West Coast. About half my life split between Seattle and the other half in California.
Yeah. So I spent. I mean, I lived in California for about let me see how many years. About 10 years, 10, 15 years. So mostly about 10 of those out of the Bay Area, which I enjoyed a lot. But it came to have a lot of people. Bay Area is pretty busy.
Yeah, it definitely is. And remind me, you ended up in Colorado?
Yeah. So now I'm in Colorado, and so I'm up in the mountains, and I kind of enjoy it that way. Whereas you know, well, it looks like we have Jules is trying to join up. Let's see if she's able to pop on. So, oh no, we lost her again. She's having connectivity problems. We have everybody having connectivity problems today, but it's good. It's good that we have like 3 hosts so that we can always work through this.
No doubt. I think my last 2 kind of live webinars, I've managed to have the internet go out in my office, so I'm kind of used to the COVID trials.
Yeah, I was and that's always the case here. And we were just saying that I'm up in the mountains, and so internet's not always the best or reliable up where I'm at. So I'm trying to get that. I'm waiting for Elon Musk to get his Starlink going. I need to have some of that so I can have a backup for sure. We'll see when that happens. But yeah, and then but I just did this webinar yesterday on the changes of remote work and how the speed of communication is advancing around the world. And it's just so funny because my son just got back from a trip to Mexico. He was down there with some of his buddies doing some fishing, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I bumped into these guys at the local hostel, and one's a teacher, teaching online classes, and the other one is and designing apps, and they've been living out of the hostel for the past 6 months, just hanging out at the beach and doing work." And yeah, that's the
yeah. We actually have a good buddy. He's a designer, and so he's predominantly done freelance work for the 15 years that we've known him. And other than occasionally having a lease here and there, never really had too many roots. So it was definitely a Carmen Sandiego sort of friendship where we had to look up to see where he was for 2 months at a time.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about people moving around a lot on this forum. It's just the reality of what's going on now. I mean, a lot of companies woke up and, halfway through the pandemic and found their employees moved from San Francisco out to Arkansas or whatever. So a lot of difference.
Yeah. I heard a new term, and I see if I'm remembering it correctly, but companies had to figure out where you were laying your head in order to manage things like payroll and mobility and everything else. So it was no longer what's your home address or your work address, but
yeah,
literally, where is your head right now? Where's that pillow?
All right, so we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and kick things off. I know I keep on seeing Jules pop on and off the forum here. She just cannot get a connection, so I don't think we're going to have her today. But let's go ahead and get things kicked off here. So welcome everyone to the People Strategy Forum. We are a mastermind of leaders dedicated to creating workplaces where people thrive, employees reward, and customers love. And we usually have a whole host of people here. You know, Jules, unfortunately, like I just mentioned, is having some connectivity issues, and so it looks like she's not going to be able to be with us today. And either is Shar. Shar is down in Mexico and setting up her workspace down there, so she doesn't have connectivity. But we're lucky enough here to have Sumit Singla with us once again. Sumit is an expert in people strategies out of India. And if you've joined the forum here before, I mean, Sumit is a wealth of knowledge, of global knowledge of people strategies across the world. And he brings that global perspective to us here at the People Strategy Forum. And then myself, and I am Sam Reeve, and I am a compensation and rewards expert. So I'm also an expert in talent management, and I'm here sponsor these forums with the comp team, and happy to have you here every week. So a little bit about the forum is that we have we are broadcasting, multicasting across several channels. So we're on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And so if you happen to be on one of those platforms listening in, and if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and leave those in the chat there, and we'll get to those. And if you are live with us on the Zoom platform right now, just go ahead and leave those in the chat, and we can ask questions as we go along, and we'll answer those as part of the discussion. So let's go ahead and introduce our guest today, John Berg. John Berg is a co-founder of Infinite Equity. He's also a partner of one of our comp team. We are fortunate enough to use Infinite Equity services in a lot of our clients, and so they're a trusted partner. Now the important part of what John does and his team does is they help companies and their leaders make the right decisions when they're dealing with those equity questions, as far as their stock pool, how much they have to spend. There's no easy answer, as far as there's no one size fits all. Equity is something that's customized to a company situation, and why it's quite an important topic of today. So to kind of kick things off, John, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the equity world and doing what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And first off, thanks for having me. Pretty exciting. I think this might be my first debut on some of those platforms that you just listed off there. So very exciting to be here for this conversation. A little bit of the background. I used to refer to myself as a recovering pension actuary because it told a lot of the story. But since it's been 15 or 16 years since I actually was a certified actuary, I think it's gone a little stale. But I actually started my career doing pension work, and really got involved in not only determining the liabilities, but gaining an appreciation for some of the employee behavior that underlines how you develop the liabilities for a massive set of people covered under a pension arrangement. So it was interesting work, but I was always looking for a way out, looking for that greener side. And it kind of lucked out that in about 2004, the exposure draft related to stock-based comp for accounting purposes didn't so much rewrite the rules, because largely what they were taking is the accounting standard and moving it from a pro forma basis into the income statement. But it shined a giant light on, okay, now these numbers start to become more real. It's not stock options are king because they're free. We really got to run it through the income statement. So I was able to kind of leverage my actuarial background and apply it directly into equity. And needless to say, that being 17 years or so ago, it really kind of set off a fire and a passion more broadly, just about concepts of using equity as compensation to employees. And as we'll get into some of the nuances in today's conversation, even more broadly than just specifically equity, is just this idea of sharing the ownership of the entity that employees are building. So fast forward along the way, about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we left a large consulting firm and launched Infinite Equity to really kind of double down on this passion and work with a much wider range of companies which has brought us into private companies, LLCs, family businesses, some of the stuff that we'll kind of get in and try and dissect for those that are on the phone and kind of thinking about how it applies to their own situation.
Great. Yeah. So, equity is quite an important part of compensation. And, I know a lot of our listeners on the call are probably wondering, can I even have equity or a long-term incentive program at my company and so forth. But first of all, can you kind of tell us the different forms of long-term incentive that small private companies might entertain in?
Yeah. And this is probably a good way to kind of level set the concepts, because when we refer to equity, we might think of it as a universal umbrella, but it's really specific to what corporations can provide to their employees. So sometimes it gets a little bit lost in translation when an LLC is thinking about what they can do in terms of sharing. So I like how you framed it in terms of, let's think about this as long-term incentives. How are we taking this idea of providing compensation or even benefits in some forms to our employees, but doing it in a way that it's also sharing an ownership concept? So we use kind of LTI and ownership more as the umbrella, and then get into whether it's equity, profits, interest, phantom awards, because a lot of that corporate structure, as well as what you're trying to achieve, helps you down that path. So let's look at it from corporations. Corporations, whether it's designated as a corporation or an S corp pass through, this is an opportunity where you can use real equity. And typically the way to think about it is that you have an idea of an appreciation vehicle, what we commonly think of as stock options, but the idea being the value conveyed is based off of increasing the value of the company. And then we also have the concept of shares. Those are the two predominant vehicles available for corporations. And from there, you get into, well, what do we want to buy with this equity? Are we just looking for retention and sharing and upside, or are we looking for more specific performance milestones? So then you get into all these different flavors, which can get confusing. But if you take a step back, the two vehicles are this idea of an appreciation or the full value share. Mm-hmm. So that's corporations. Now, the good news is most of those same concepts translate into other forms of corporate identity or kind of tax situation. So let's look at LLCs for a second as a segment. Here, you're not really using equity per se. You're using units, membership units within the organization. But the concepts of the value conveyed, appreciation, that's the same as a stock option, just a little bit different mechanics and how you write it up. Are you using full units? Similarly, very similar to what you see in corporations. So even though there's all these different flavors, when you get down to deciding what you want to do, starting with the philosophy helps determine how you're going to make the decision later on. And then the third category is this idea of phantom or cash-based LTI. And there's lots of different reasons. And this is a little bit agnostic to what sort of corporate structure you have, where you might form or develop an LTI program, but with the intent for it to be fully denominated in cash. And so we see this sometimes as long-term cash, or when you hear the term phantom, it's still cash-based, but the idea is it's intended to replicate the economic benefits as if it was real equity or real units. So those are, I'm going to kind of repeat them because I threw a lot at you. You've got real equity, appreciation, or full units. LLCs, it's the same concept, just different tax structure. And then you have a third category, which is cash-based.
Yeah, so I often find that a lot of the confusion in this is lost in translation with the terms, right? So the bottom line is whether you're a public company or a private company, you can have the same types or vehicles that perform very much the same, and it's just they're named differently in the different environments, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as I know you spend a lot of time with your clients, part of avoiding some of that confusion is spending time up front, helping them develop what their compensation philosophy is, and then even more specifically, what are the objectives you're trying to get out of here? Because a lot of
Right.
times we'll get the question, we want to provide equity, or we want to provide an ownership opportunity to employees, but it's a little bit of a blank slate. So having clearly defined objectives and a compensation philosophy almost works as a North Star to that company, so that when you get further down the line and start deciding things like vesting and liquidity and some of the other kind of challenging things that are important to think through and have a myriad of decisions later on, having that North Star to kind of go back to and check it against, well, how well does this decision align with those objectives?
Right.
Certainly makes the rest of the design process easier.
Yeah, because I've had several clients. I mean, some will say, "Hey, we want to create an ownership culture where everybody's an owner and so forth." And then we have other clients that go, "Well, hey, I don't want to really give up or dilute my ownership, but I want people to think like owners." I mean, and so they have different types of philosophies on how they want to run their business. And so, but there's the nice thing is that there's a solution for each one of those strategies, right?
Yeah, there absolutely there absolutely is, and I think you said it really well. Is that there is, regardless of what the fact pattern is or the objectives of the owners or the founders, there is a solution that's going to align with those. But it's also, I think, important to point out there's a lot of solutions that they could end up with that don't align very well with some of those objectives, and so that's why it's so important to have that and have some agreement in order to kind of guide them to the point where it best aligns with those decisions. Said another way, a lot of times we're getting involved, so let's say a pre-IPO company, and having to go back and look at some of the decisions made 5-10 years before. There's oftentimes a lot of areas you can point back to and kind of raise the question, well, why did you do this? Or did you clearly hadn't thought about some of the downstream implications.
Yeah, but when and so before we get into the details of the strategy around this, let's stay on the topic of communication and understanding, because one of the big problems with equity programs or long-term incentive programs is that they're confusing the people. I mean, whether you're an owner or a leader or an employee, and let's just cut to the chase. I don't know how many executives I've spoken to who are supposed to know equity plans, but then they secretly don't really know about how they operate, and so they're then themselves are also intimidated. So as far as these plans, I find that one of the most important things is the perceived value. Perceived value. So somebody's not going to value a plan or value a compensation component unless they understand. Because when I talk to employees, they go, "Well, you have some equity, so tell me, what do you think it's worth?" And they go, "Well, something between $0 and $1 million." Because it's either going to be, I don't really consider it part of my comp. It's just I think that it's kind of like a lottery ticket. I might become rich someday or something, but I really focus more on my cash. So do you ever come across that, John, in your practice?
Yeah, we definitely come across that a lot. I was hoping you were going to give me the magic formula for how you actually convey that understanding and perceived value, because I don't think we're going to solve it in this, but I do think we could probably share some tips that we think work well in a communication. So I'm going to kind of answer it two ways. One is a transparency aspect, and here there's a lot of things that I think companies can do, but I understand why there's some limitations. So first and foremost, you go through a lot of time and effort to develop a plan, have it adopted, determine how much to give people, what features to put on those awards, how to come back and kind of refresh it. Where I don't think we spend enough time is is one in the communication, but just providing some of the transparency and the things that will help them understand what they have, and through that provide develop greater appreciation. So simplest thing is get a cap table and an equity management system which allows your employees to go in there and see their awards. No more spreadsheets, right? There's lots of solutions out there that can align really well. And it doesn't matter if it's real equity, these units, or even cash-based. Most of them have the flexibility. So start there. Also, there's some shyness with companies in terms of providing transparency on what the 409A value is with the company. Obviously, employees will, if they're giving options, they'll see the strike price. And so that conveys kind of the starting point. They don't necessarily have visibility to the rest of the cap table. They may not know the total value of the company. To the extent as the owners are comfortable providing more direct transparency or an understanding as to what those aspects are. And then more importantly, as the future 409A values are determined, convey that, right? It's still paper gains. There still may not be liquidity for a number of years, and you'll want to get that across. But start to build some of the understanding of, we're growing this entity together. How does that translate into this promise you gave me through this equity instrument? Mm-hmm. So that transparency is kind of number one in terms of area for improvement that I think can happen. So then we get into kind of classic communication and education. And here I'd like to get your guys' thoughts as well. But there's two elements of psychology that we try to tap into when we're rolling out a new plan or doing education on existing awards. The first is when we're getting into the what you have and the terms and everything else, we do find that if we can associate it by analogy to something that we think they have a pretty good understanding, if we can do that first, then that helps to draw a connection between what may be a new term and what may be something that already exists. So real quickly, we do this in stock purchase plans, sometimes matching schemes. To the extent we can associate that you save money into your 401k, we match it with some dollars or profits. You have similar opportunities in share purchase plans where you're savings, purchasing shares. So being able to draw that connection, I think, is key. And there's similar parallels, which we don't need to get into with the different types of instruments as well. Mm-hmm. But then the second principle that we try to tap into is help them appreciate what they can do with the money. And this might be segmented by different generations. If you have a younger workforce, helping them understand that this can pay off some student debt in the future. It may help towards being able to plant your roots in terms of a down payment. Get them thinking not just in this instrument they have, but what it might mean in the future. I see one of my longtime friends in the audience there, Emily Savino, so I'm going to call her out. Emily's at Fidelity, but she always tells the story of the first ESPP she participated in. Thanks to those purchases, she built a deck off of her house. And that really, this was probably 15 or 16 years ago. I heard her say this in a speech, and it stuck with me that long, that's what built the appreciation and her love for ESPPs is what she was able to do with that money. So I try to encourage clients, don't be afraid to kind of plant some of those seeds in terms of what this might mean. So instead of thinking it's that lottery ticket, $0 million, get them thinking about something that's actually more tangible, paying off my debt, putting a down payment, helping with some other expenses, mm-hmm. savings, wealth generation. Any one of those, I think, is fair game. So those are the two psychological things. Relate it to something they know, and then get them thinking about what they can do with it. Sam or Sumit, what things have you kind of learned or tricks over the years to build appreciation?
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point about, I think that is really all those things you mentioned there, John, as far as communicating value and making sure that there's regular communication as how the company is doing and how that translates into the different plans and so forth. But Sumit, I would really love to hear your impression on how equity and long-term incentive plans are perceived in different places on the globe and in so forth. What do you typically see in India?
Um, I think John hit the nail right on the head by saying they're not communicated well enough. And usually it's a lot of jargon, it's a lot of complicated language. I wish there could just be a lemonade stand version of what an equity plan is all about. And also what you could do with the money, the example like the one from Emily, and I see that she's just put in a comment saying she's added a second story to her first home thanks to an ESPP. So I think that
I
would
knew the deck
make it
was
a lot more
wrong.
real for people, where they would understand. So especially some of the younger generation who've not really maybe understood financial markets and understood shares and trading in so much detail. I think it'll help them um, to really get into wealth creation. Also, the demographic context in India and Asia is a little different, where um, till the age of let's say 2022, you don't really uh, children or teenagers don't really pick up jobs as such. You're dependent on your parents till you finish your undergrad course, and then that's when you start working and start being a little more financially independent. So people get financial prudence a little later in life, age-wise, and I think it'll really help to maybe have a simple version of an equity plan explained in the onboarding itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe even before, so if you're trying to attract quality talent, maybe you can build it into your employer value proposition itself and say that we believe in creating owners, not employees. And once you join us, this is what is the value you'll add to yourself in addition to your salary.
Right. So definitely having that strong communication plan. I mean, that's mostly areas. Communication is typically where I see equity fail in companies. If they don't have it well communicated, it's going to be undervalued. But so John, in your experience, and when we're thinking about some small companies and that are out there, or startups and so forth, that are mom and pop shops, that they're thinking, well, this equity is too complicated, or maybe I can just go buy my cash comp and just deal with cash comp. And so what are some of the reasons that you hear that small companies don't have equity plans?
Yeah. So, and I want to call out something that Sumit said I thought was fantastic before I answer this question or kind of move on, is don't forget it's kind of a marketing opportunity to the employees. So selling the reason why you're giving the equity. We said we're trying to shift the mindset from employees to owners. I thought was just absolutely crystal clear as something that you would communicate in terms of purpose that could really be beneficial to the long-term appreciation. So actually, maybe that's a good segue into your question, Sam. Is so we think about companies that don't want to do it. I think the litany of reasons, some very valid, some probably not, or that laundry list is going to be pretty long. You hit on a few of them: complicated, cost, do we get the real benefit of it or not, and a whole host of other reasons are some of the things that we hear. As I said, many of them are going to be spot on valid for the situation or for the way they're looking at it. But it could be a situation where if you shift the lens or shift the strategy in terms of what you would actually be doing to extend ownership, some of those might go away. So for example, let's take a family-owned business, one that has built a nice profitable business, has paid employees well, competitive salaries, competitive cash incentives, probably a good 401k, and has done well up into this point. We've run into a handful of these just in the last couple of years as we've been concentrating more in this market. But what they're finding is they're still maybe not as competitive to some public corporations or even private corporations that offer equity as part of the mix. So that's at least driving some of the consideration on ownership, and two, actually losing some people that they think they otherwise might have been able to retain. So it gets them thinking, like, could we do ownership? A real blocker is, well, yeah, we could do equity, but we are a family-owned business. We don't intend to sell to a competitor in the future. Maybe we'll hand it off to our generation, but it's so far out in the time horizon that it's just not conceivable, and we're not on a growth trajectory to go public, right? So staying private, when we think about exit strategy, sorry for a second, staying private is absolutely one of those paths. So oftentimes we only think of trade sale and going public as the exit strategies, but permanently private or private for the foreseeable future is absolutely something that should be thought of as an exit strategy. So they're on this permanently private sort of exit strategy. They want to be more competitive for ownership, but they don't really actually want to give away ownership or deal with some of the hassles. So that is a legitimate burden to overcome. But this is where shifting the lens in terms of what the strategy is can still strike the right balance. And so this is where the fact pattern comes into play, where phantom equity might make a lot of sense. So here now, you're basically going through the same design considerations as if you were going to give out, say, stock options. You're allocating a certain percentage and ultimately implementing a phantom cash plan where the liquidity through cash and profits is going to mimic as if someone received stock options and exercised at a specific period of time later. So it can be done. It does introduce a couple new variables, which is you should have a way of valuing both the company as well as the underlying phantom units that you're giving out. This is commonly done through multiples of EBITDA. Typically, when you're in this situation, it's a profitable business because you do need to be able to ensure you've got the cash flow later. So multiple of EBITDA is a fantastic way to drive this. Now you've got an equity or ownership strategy, and you have a formula in which to convey value. Dole it out, provide some transparency, communicate, and I think you can really accomplish the ownership objectives even without providing the real ownership.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Have you? But what if? Have you been hearing the argument lately that, well, geez, my employees don't stay that long anyway. I mean, having people that are here for, we're lucky to keep them for 2 years or 3 years, and then they move on. And so, what do you do in situations like that?
Yeah. Well, I think first is to take stock on whether that's a problem or not. What type of business is it, and is that turnover just part of the business you're running, or is a lot of that excess turnover, unnecessary turnover that you would cut down? If that's the case, then having equity or a long-term incentive that spans multiple years is proven to reduce some of that unwanted turnover. Further, we've seen some good evidence that employees will choose an employer that offers an ownership or equity stake over one that doesn't. We've seen 2/3 roughly, as well as in other surveys that 3/4 of employees would rather work for a company that has employee ownership or is fully employee owned. So we know there's a lot of good data on attraction, retention, and reducing turnover and use of equity. So if we were to encounter that situation, I would kind of turn it around and ask more questions along the lines of why not, and really try to drill in to see if there's an ownership formula or strategy which would actually address the underlying concern that they're losing people every couple of years.
Mhm. Right. I mean,
I realize easier said than done, but that it's where the process is just as important than the outcome.
totally agree. Understanding your employee demographic is key in the reasons why people are leaving, because that is one thing that we're seeing in this this environment that we're in now, or for the past 6 months or so, when there's people have been leaving companies at a higher rate, I guess dubbed the Great Resignation, right? So there's been a lot of thoughts of hey, perhaps we should have a plan that keeps people here long term and so forth. And so this sounds like there's several types of vehicles. And so let's talk about the reasons why you would choose a different vehicle. You just mentioned one. If you're going to stay, private, you're going to be closely held, or maybe that's a family business and there's a way to have a program there. So, but if you're thinking about what are other situations where companies deal with, and that might call for a different type of plan.
Yeah. So I touched on this a little bit in the beginning part of this conversation. There are some things that absolutely will point you towards a certain vehicle or not. So corporate structure, corporations versus LLCs.
Mm-hmm.
That's a clear delineation in terms of what you're actually able to give in terms of an instrument. And there's real tax implications in terms of giving them, particularly at LLCs. It does change the employee-employer relationship for those receiving it. So if we put LLCs aside for just a second, because some of the tax implications, it's much easier to kind of take a step back and think about, okay, we want to convey an ownership opportunity, and ask the question, what do we want in return for that? And the answers, as you can imagine, at each company are going to be a little bit different, and even within companies, key stakeholders may answer some of these questions differently. So some of this is kind of a synthesis of different views into concrete objectives and that compensation philosophy. But what you're looking for is if the pendulum is swinging more towards kind of motivation, sharing in the growth of what we're building, incenting for specific performance, it probably means you're looking to do something more in this appreciation vehicle, stock option sort of concept. It may even be explicit performance triggers tied to achievement of strategic milestones or of growth values. So in all of those situations, it probably means stock options or something synthetic to a stock option where value is derived through growth from the point of time that you give the ownership to when liquidity is provided. If you're looking more towards a retention concept, how do we lower that voluntary turnover, and how do we kind of convey just an ownership culture? You may not tie it necessarily to growing the company. You may tie it more towards you're an important part of this team, and we're going to give you this stake of shares here, but we're going to have you earn it over the next 3 or 4 year period. And in some cases, in full value awards, it can even be tied to a liquidity event, which gets in some of the reasons there, get into some of the tax nuances, which maybe we'll cover a little bit later here. But at a high level, what we're looking for is kind of retention versus growth, and some subtler qualities in terms of determining which of those two types of vehicles. Then, and not to fully kind of rehash it, if there's any concerns around giving real ownership, concerns over the complications of real equity, the tax treatment, and we're just okay settling in cash, that's the reason why even though you may kind of create it in a phantom situation, if you intend to settle in cash or you don't want to give away ownership, then you're going to be on this cash denominated or phantom stock side of the equation.
So you did mention tax a few times, and I know that there's of course we can't give tax advice or anything like that on this call, but that is one thing to consider in depending on tax and regulation and where you are issuing your grants, right? So if it's outside the U.S., there may be things that need to be considered. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so tax is a very important as well as very annoying aspect of ownership opportunities, whether real equity or phantom, and then it's further complicated by a couple factors. Where is the company itself domiciled, and then where are the employees from a local jurisdiction? And this is where if you start with kind of tax and implications and you haven't done the legwork up in the beginning in terms of what are we trying to do, you can often find yourself going down a path of letting the tax drive your decisions. So the first kind of cautionary element is know the tax treatment and the regimes, and sometimes even the securities laws. Have a good understanding of that, but don't immediately jump down the path of designing something to specifically comply, or I shouldn't say comply, but to align with the specific tax treatment. Particularly for global workforces, being able to convey a unifying benefit, this ownership plan, I think is pretty important. And then coming back and explaining some of the tax nuances. So that's the first part of it. Now, even though I've said that as a caveat, it's important to know the tax requirements. And then if there's an opportunity to make something more tax favorable to the employee, absolutely explore that. And so there's a handful of countries where there are qualified opportunities for tax benefit. Usually it means qualifying the gain for better treatment than ordinary income taxes. Some countries, there's very little tax or reporting implications. And then clearly too many different jurisdictions to get into today. But I think the two parts to kind of leave you with is don't let the tax regime drive the design, but be aware of it and take opportunities where you can.
Yeah. And I guess the big message is if you have employees outside the country or in different locations, definitely consider the tax impact and what happens to basically their cash flow or their disposable income. Are they going to be more burdened in certain areas versus others? And then also back to the meaningfulness of equity. Is that something that's meaningful in their culture? Because what we sometimes just to talk about Americans, we can be a little US centric at times, thinking that
we've never done that.
Yeah. Thinking that everybody else, well, yeah, equity, everybody should value that, but it's not quite true. And so in some cultures, it's simply not as important. So we need to make sure that we take that in consideration. But what I'd like to hear now, I know, Sumit, you were telling me about a situation about how you're seeing companies do equity or differently or emerge with different ideas. And so I'd like to kind of explore that in this next segment about what's happening new in the marketplace. So Sumit, can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
So one of the most interesting ones, Sam, was an Indian company that was in the news recently. So they're about 6 or 7 years old. The company's into meat and seafood, and they've created a program where they say everyday vesting, anytime liquidation. So during the year, you can liquidate your equity at any point of time, and they don't really hold you to a longer term duration of vesting. So it's also an outcome of the fact that they've actually quadrupled in size in the last 5 years. So people who are there, they do know that there's hyper growth that's happening, and they're not really tempted to cash out and leave quickly. So, I mean, most of their people, they've been with the company since the start, and they're hiring aggressively as well. And the message that's going out in the market is the fact that this is a good, stable company with more than double-digit growth, and that's likely to continue for the next 5 or 10 years. So even without trying to lock people in, so not everyone might be happy with the everyday vesting kind of a formula. And I mean, I can sense a lot of experts criticizing it, but it does work for these people. Also, for the larger companies, like say, I know Pepsi used to do this till a few years ago. They used to have cash compensation, but it was deferred cash. So you had the option of collecting 100% of your bonus at the end of year one, or you could say, I don't want 100% of it right now. I'm willing to park some percentage of it till next year when I'll get an additional amount for it. So if it's supposed to be $100 at the end of year one, I'll only collect 80 right now, and that 20 will say become 30, or it'll become 40 at the end of year two. So, and by that time, when that bonus is ready, you're already in line for your year two bonus as well. So it's a cycle that keeps on ongoing. And of course, I don't know if this is a US centric practice as well, discounting on equity shares. And the way companies in India have started marketing it is one, the exchange rate. So the dollar is a strong currency, and of course the price of the Indian rupee versus the dollar, it's only been going one way for the last many years. So as the exchange rate fluctuates and the dollar grows stronger, even if the share price stays still, you'll still be making money. And of course, with a growing company, you end up making a lot more. On top of it, you get a 10-15% discount on the market price of the shares. So even on day one, you're already making money. And that's lucrative. And then, of course, similar to what John was talking about earlier, companies like Adobe, I think this might just be a global plan that they have. You can take your performance pay in cash, or you can take it in terms of equity shares as well. So they're fine with, and you can take it in different ratios. You can you don't necessarily have to convert all of it into shares. You can say, I'll take 50% cash, 50% shares. These are some of the practices that I came across, which are pretty popular among the younger generation as well.
Are you seeing a change in how the demographics perceived equity and how that plan design is for the future, John?
Yeah, I think Sami hit on a couple of things that I think are really interesting to kind of dive into. Now, we don't have the full answers, but part of that with Adobe, and I think Netflix has been doing this for a while with cash comp trading in for equity stakes, I think with a little bit of an enhancer, is what you're really offering is a choice. And so while still a minority practice in the US companies that we work with, we have seen this kind of growing in interest and in different applications. So when we think about choice, oftentimes it's stock versus options, and there's plenty of those examples out there. But we have seen an increasing number of ones where it's cash or bonus in exchange or a choice for options. As well as when you think about just the broader concept of an employee stock purchase plan, the one that Sami was talking about that is growing in popularity in terms of Indian-based employees, is here's we've seen a real dramatic increase both in the adoption of plans, but also with all of the new IPO and direct listings, the number of companies, including in the SPP, is in near 90% prevalence. At its heart, it's very much a choice or an offer to employees as well. Do you want to participate or do you not? And the choice is, do you want to use some of your own capital to buy into our company? Now we'll give you an additional benefit on that, typically a discount, look back, sometimes a match. But to me, it's a really compelling offer, and it says a lot about the psychology of the employee's interest in both the company as well as the broader concept of ownership culture. Because unlike giving RSUs or giving stock options, this is an offer that they need to assess on their own terms and determine if it's a good offer for themselves. So in that respect, and this is where the actuarial mindset of mine gets really excited, there's human behavior that you can go and measure. And here, when we've really kind of broken down some of the impact of, or kind of bifurcated between those participating and those not participating, we've seen some really discernible benefits. So lower voluntary turnover among those participating in purchase plans, higher performance ratings, and then higher engagement scores. This is on a small subset of companies where we've been able to kind of dig underneath the hood, but starting with the hypothesis that ESPPs are great and employees that are participating in them are more engaged with their company and their day-to-day jobs, it's nice to see some of that data bear out. So those are a couple of the things. I liked something else that with equity, there's so many different decisions you can make, and that gives an opportunity that you might do something a little bit out of the norm, and you might be criticized for it, as Sumit had said, but it might actually make perfect sense to why you're doing it for your employees. I think of Pinterest maybe, I don't know, 8-9 years ago, still as a private company, that basically said, you know what, we're not going to truncate your exercise window if you leave the company. Typically what happens is once you vest in options, you have till the contractual period as long as you remain an employee. But if you leave, oftentimes that window chops down to 1 to 3 months. Pinterest said, no, we're going to give you the whole term. If you were here and you earn these options, we're going to still allow you to enjoy the benefits of future growth even after you left. It certainly made some news at the time. Probably got more criticism from other companies, I'm guessing, because they didn't want that to become the new trend. But for them, they felt like it really worked, and it aligned with kind of their ethos in terms of, we're giving you this compensation for the services, but it's yours at that point. And, you know, even if you leave us, we want you to continue sharing in the growth that you've built beyond that. We don't want to handcuff you, particularly while a private company. And I think there's a handful of other examples that we could pull out, but the idea of don't be afraid to experiment, but make sure it works for you is probably a good guideline to follow.
Right. Well, a lot of these, some emerging practices, but as you mentioned, the vast majority are still doing the kind of the plain vanilla approaches, of course, that have been tried and true to over time. But so let's say that some of our listeners out there, some of the leaders are saying, oh, yeah, this sounds interesting. Maybe I should consider getting started or in a plan. What are some of the first steps that they should be doing? And I know we talked a little bit about comp philosophy and so forth, but if you were to give them a list of the first things to think about, what would that be?
So the first thing to think about, or at least take stock of, is what type of company are you, right? Just because that does have some real tax and employee relationship considerations. But beyond that, what you really want to take the time to do is think about what is there a problem that you're trying to solve, or what are the other kind of why reasons you're considering extending ownership to the employees. Okay, get that out, jot them down. It's really helpful to see them react to them, particularly if there's more than one person involved in making these decisions. Number two on that is think about what it is you're trying to get from your employees in terms of extending this ownership. What are you trying to, I don't like the term buy, but in some respects, if it's compensation or benefits, it's always this employer-employee kind of relationship, and you want something out of them. Is it longer service? Is it more loyalty? Is it a feeling that what their day-to-day job impacts the growth of the company, but also directly the value of their stake? Get some of those elements out as well, in terms of what you want from extending this. And then the third aspect is be real clear just to yourself. This doesn't have to fully be communicated more broadly, but what's the longer term strategy of the corporation? So the company, excuse me. So this gets into time horizon and the exit strategy. And while it may be a balance that, okay, we're growing this company, we think we can get it here, we might become appealing to a competitor. And so a trade sale is quite possible. If things really go well and we've got good momentum and backing, potentially it's a public event. You don't have to be right on that, but have a clear understanding of kind of what you're guiding to and how long that might take, recognizing everything's a moving target. The reason those are important is that depending on what type of ownership vehicle you're going to use and how you're going to design it, you do need to think about time horizon and liquidity. And particularly more so now than 15 years ago, is that the permanently private or the longer period to going public has changed. And so even with a 10-year stock option, there may still be a need to provide liquidity to employees because there isn't going to be liquidity through an IPO that you might have seen with companies 10, 15 years ago. So just as a reminder, kind of the three things is why are you doing this? What are you trying to get from it? And then corporate strategy time horizon.
Great. So I know there's we've talked about a lot of things, and we are approaching the top of the hour. So I do want to acknowledge our speaker for next week, and we are going to have Linda Rad join us, and she's going to talk about coaching and connecting for managers in the hybrid role. So basically, the issues that a lot of managers are seeing is that they're not used to managing in a remote environment. And so how are we really going to connect and develop our people in this remote or hybrid environment that we're experiencing in the modern day world? So come back and see us next week at the People Strategy Forum to hear Linda Rad on that important topic. Great. So as we approach the top of the hour here, John, I just want to say thank you for joining us and sharing your wisdom here. If there's any of our listeners that would like to ask any questions, please drop them in the chat for John. We can take those as in these final moments. But how can people reach you, John, if they want to learn more about equity and installing a plan into their organization?
Yeah, so our website is probably the best place because it has my number and a generic email to it. So infiniteequity.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. Infinite Equity is our company page. But directly to me, it's John, Jon, so don't put the H in there, at infiniteequity.com. It does look like Michael Lackey had a question here. Michael and I actually go back as coworkers like 15 years ago for a brief stint. So he was going back to the idea of using multiple of EBITDA as the value of the currency, and brought up a question, what about using external valuation firms to establish the share of the enterprise value, commonly referred to as 409A values? Great question. So multiple EBITDA is a concept predominantly only going to be used in that family-owned business or phantom stock only strategy where it's all going to be cash denominated. And so, and it's a profitable business because you've got to be able to provide that liquidity at the settlement date. Multiple of EBITDA tends to be a pretty easy one because it's fully within the company's control, doesn't trigger additional external costs of getting the business valuation. So it's a little bit of a unique situation. Doesn't mean corporations can't use multiple of EBITDA, but it does tend to be unique to phantom stock plans. If you're not doing a phantom stock plan, then going and getting the external valuation is the predominant practice. That's the 409A. Frequency once a year in the early stages. If you're leading up to a liquidity event, that's where more frequent valuations are usually warranted.
Mm-hmm. And then going out to an external valuation firm to get that to that 409A or whatever, are there some, how does the company go about doing this? Do you typically have some recommendations or where do they go to start this process?
Yeah. The simplest thing is type 409A into a search bar, and you're going to get a laundry list of companies, business valuation specialists that provide it. Also be aware, some of the cap table and equity management softwares do have as built into the service in your subscription. You may be entitled to a 409A valuation through that subscription. So there may be that opportunity there as well that you're not even aware of. But generally, there's a lot of companies, depending on your complexity. If you're simpler, then you're going to aim for ones that maybe have simple in the name, easy. If you're getting later stage and you have a complex cap table, then you're going to look for kind of more of the household names, the larger firms that have dozens or hundreds of business valuation specialists. I'm happy to provide referrals in terms of companies we've worked with and referred and trust really well. But
Great.
There's a lot of choices out there and a lot of price points to fit budgets too. Perfect.
Well, thanks, John. Really appreciate it. I think that was our last question. So I just want to say thank you once again for just sharing your knowledge and really appreciate the conversation. And for those listeners out there, if you need help, please reach out to John and Infinite Equity. They're an excellent resource. We love working with them. So thanks once again, John. All right, everybody.
Thanks so much for having me.
Everybody have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week in the People Strategy Forum.